Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
All right, once again, Brad Powers filling in for both Todd Fuhrman and Payne Insider as we are previewing all of the Group of Five conferences here on the Bet the Board podcast. Todd and Payne will be back once we get to the Power Four. That's right, Power Four conferences here in a few weeks. But I got to give them credit. They said, hey, you're long-winded enough. They didn't want to participate and take any wind out of my sail as far as talking small schools. They know I love it. They know I live for this type of stuff. So I'm going to be flying solo here, not only last week when we discussed the Conference USA, but the next few weeks. Next week will be Mountain West, followed by the Sun Belt, and then we'll wrap it up as far as the G5 conferences with the American. But today, we are talking a conference that's near and dear to my heart. It is the Mid-American Conference, and I did graduate from MAC school, that being Bowling Green. We'll get to the Falcons here in a second. But generally speaking, the MAC is a much different conference than what I was when I was attending and growing up. Not to age myself, but I was in school when Urban Meyer was there at Bowling Green, when Roethlisberger was quarterbacking the Red Hawks. And the conference, you could make a case, might have been the best small conference in all of college football. You had Toledo with Gary Pinkel, who ended up being a Hall of Fame coach at Missouri. You had Marshall, Randy Moss, Chad Pennington there in the late 90s. You had a bunch of programs that were really good. Northern Illinois was starting to pick it up there in the late 90s, early 2000s. Not the case anymore as far as the MAC. In fact, if you're going to put it to a point spread and a power rating, I would argue that since I started doing my own power ratings here about a decade ago, if you took the average power rating in the MAC schools, those first 4 years that I was doing it, power rating every single team in the FBS, you took that average of the MAC power rating those first 4 years, 2015 to 2018, we're down right now last year and heading into this year about a touchdown on average per team. That's how much the MAC's lost. Obviously, there's a few things happening here. Bigger picture, last couple of decades, you got a talent drain to the South. Population shift towards the Sun Belt. Number of players from Chicago, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Nothing compared to even what it was 20 years ago as far as the number of prospects. Obviously, the Rust Belt is where the MAC is. You don't have those high-paying factory jobs anymore like you had in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the talent drain has shifted towards the South. Another talent drain, and this is more specific to the last couple of years, and it's impacting all of the G5 conferences. But, man, the MAC's been hit as hard as any conference. You're seeing the best players in the conference get poached as far as the transfer portal. And a lot of them getting poached even post-spring. So that's having a big-time negative effect as far as these power ratings go. If you're taking an average of what the MAC used to be, not even that long ago, 5, 7, 8, 9 years ago, certainly down here recently in the last couple of years. But without further ado, we got a couple of news as far as the MAC for this year. No more divisions in the MAC. So I just was reading a preview magazine, and they had it broken down as far as the MAC East and West. That's going to be wrong, folks. There are no divisions starting this year. 4 pods of 3 teams. That each they're going to face each other every season to protect rivalries like Bowling Green and Toledo. All 3 Michigan directional schools are in the same pod. And what will happen is the 2 teams with the highest conference win percentage, they're going to go to the MAC championship game. So no more divisions as far as the conference goes. The West, for the most part of the last decade plus, it had been the stronger of the 2 divisions, although the East had won last year with Miami, Ohio. As far as the previews here, we're going to go from worst to first. So we're going to start with the teams at the bottom of my power rankings and work our way up. And we're going to start with a team, one of the worst teams in the country. No surprise here. We're going to start with Kent State. Not a great first season for head coach Kenny Burns last year. Obviously, Kent State was one of the worst teams in the country last year. Well, you just look at some basic metrics. Number 131 in yards per play margin, number 129 in yards per game margin, dead last in scoring margin, getting outscored by 20 points per game. That was Kent State last year. Power ratings wise, if you're comparing it, I just got done comparing, hey, the MAC's way down compared to what it used to be. Kent State last year was way down. In fact, if you're looking at power ratings wise, this is their worst team in 20 plus years. And that's coming on the heels. Sean Lewis, who left for Colorado. Now Sean Lewis, the head coach at San Diego State this year, he made Kent State super competitive. A couple of bowl games, and they were never an easy out. So, the big drastic downfall for Kent State last year. The worry that I have for this year is the staff, believe it or not. You would think, okay, second year they're in better shape. Well, not really, because short-staffed as far as the spring. In fact, post-spring, Burns had to add a couple of coaches, a tight ends coach, a defensive end coach. And the big news coming out of the spring, their defensive coordinator stepped down in early April. They had to promote from within. Cody Morgan, a safeties coach here last year to DC. He's never been a coordinator before. They already have a new coordinator on the offense side of the ball, and Mark Carney. So 2 new coordinators in year 2 and a bunch of new coaches at other positions for Kent State. Not an ideal situation for Kenny Burns when you're wanting some continuity in year 2. You don't have a lot of continuity on defense, but what you do have is some continuity on offense. I'll start it with a basic stat that often gets overlooked as far as evaluating teams in the offseason. Offensive line, all 5 starters coming back for Kent State this year. That should help an offense that was dead last in scoring in the entire country a year ago. Quarterbacks, they had 3 quarterbacks play a bunch of snaps last year. 2 of the 3 are back. Ulatowski, I expect to probably be the quarterback. Cargman also got some snaps. Alamo, a kid from Purdue, ended up transferring yet again. All in the final month, it was Ulatowski and Cargman, though. So they took every single snap in the final month of last season. So I think they'll be in better shape than what they were a year ago there as far as the quarterback position goes. Running back, Gavin Garcia returns. He was their top rusher. Keep an eye on Kai Thomas. He's a kid that's played at Minnesota and Kansas. They're expecting big things out of him if he's healthy. At wide receiver, a kid that really flashed to me, pun intended, Christian Big Play McRae is what they call him. He was easily the Kent State's best offensive player a year ago. In fact, he got hurt in the Akron game. It took the wind out of their sails in the game. They're up 27-10. Kent State-Akron's a big rivalry game if you know small school football. Kent State's up 27-10 entering the fourth quarter. He gets hurt right around that time, and they end up losing that game. This is a kid that has a chance to have a 1,000-yard receiving yard season as long as he has some consistent quarterback play. Last year, Christian Big Play McRae was number 2 in the MAC in yards per route last year. That's one of the guy's favorite stats as far as more of the advanced stats. Luke Floria is another nice player, a wide receiver for him. So I'm kind of bullish a little bit more on the offense as far as what they have compared to last year. I think they're much improved. Defense concerns. 2 starters on defense transferred post-spring, including their defensive lineman, their best one, C.J. West. I thought he was their best player in the entire defense. He goes to Indiana. Another good pickup for Signetti, who's doing a tremendous job in the offseason in year 1 at the Hoosiers. C.J. West was like a 315-pound nose tackle type kid. You just don't get many kids like that at a place like Kent State. Guy to keep an eye on up front, Stephen Daly at defensive end, is a kid I like. Evaluating Kent State. I've said, okay, they're improved. They can't get any worse, really, than last year. Power ratings up a few points. What's that do for the win-loss record? I don't know if it does too much. I think certainly they can improve it. They only won 1 game a year ago, but, typical of Kent State, non-conference slate, road trips, Pittsburgh, Tennessee, Penn State in the first 4 weeks. They're going to be an underdog in 10 or 11 games. They're going to improve off 1-11, but I don't think it's a big jump as far as Kent State goes. Next up is that rival, Akron. And before I get to Akron, again, I buried the lead, folks. I talked about last week, hey, we might not have best bets here as far as group of 5 win totals until they get more and more widely available. Well, I buried the lead. We are going to have a best bet at the end of this podcast. We're going to double back, like I said I would, at Conference USA and give you my favorite win total as we are doing this, recording this on May the 28th. My favorite Conference USA win total. We'll double back to the first preview conference and give you out one win total best bet. I'm guessing next week or the week after we'll have multiple The MAC doesn't have enough places as far as win totals up for me to give you a MAC one, but I will double back and give you a Conference USA win total at the end of this podcast. All right, Akron. Hasn't been a great look for Joe Moorhead. First 2 years, how about back-to-back 2-10 seasons? In fact, since Terry Bowden left Akron in 2018, Akron is 7-47. Straight up, 7-47. Worst mark in the country. I will say this on Joe Moorhead's behalf. They were better, Akron, than their record indicated last year. They were just 2-5 in games decided by one possession. They lost not one, not two, but 3 games in overtime, including a game to Indiana that might have, had they won that game early in the season, might have turned their confidence around as far as the entire season, might have had a much better record. I mean, the stats said they were a little bit better than 2-10. They were number 104 in yards per play margin, 106 in yards per game margin. Typically, those types of stats say you win 3-4 games, not 2. Offense, believe it or not, was the main issue for Akron. That just so happens to be the forte for Moorhead. And the OC position's vacant as we're taping this in late May. Looks like Moorhead's going to call plays. Obviously, that's in his wheelhouse, but, I mean, I like to have if the NCAA gives me the ability to hire 10 guys as assistant coaches, I want 10 guys. I want all hands on deck there. So they're a little bit short-staffed as we're recording this in late May. Speaking of short, not much of experience. Typical of these G5 teams. Only 8 returning starters for Akron total. 3 on offense. All their top offensive players are gone. Lingard, I thought, was their best player at running back. Former 5-star kid. He didn't play like a 5-star, but he was Akron's best player a year ago. DJ Iron showed a lot of talent, just couldn't stay healthy at quarterback. He's gone. Top 3 wide receivers are gone. Daniel George, I thought, was their top guy there. Top 2 offensive linemen are gone. Now, everybody's gone. You would say, oh, that's a big-time negative. Well, it can't get much worse than what these guys did last year. I mean, they were number 1. Akron was 131 in yards per play, 129 in total offense, 130 in scoring offense. So I don't think they're going to take that much of a step back, if at all. Ben Finley comes in as a quarterback. He's been a transfer at NC State and Cal in prior stops. He's going to battle Taj Bullock, who got some snaps at towards the end of last season. Akron really likes, and I will say Moorhead's done a pretty decent job in the transfer portal. They really like this Michigan State transfer running back Jordan Simmons. So we'll see. I mean, pretty much everybody's gone, but the replacements are sufficient. Defense, in my opinion, has a lot more to work with. Top 5 tacklers are all back from a unit that actually was pretty good last year. When you think 2-10 Akron, you think, their defense was, just as bad as the offense. Not true at all. Number 31 in yards per play, number 32 in total defense. And not only their defensive end, I would argue maybe the best defensive player in the MAC, at least top 2-3 in the MAC on the defensive side of the ball, 14.5 tackles for loss. He flashes on tape. Could be a draft pick. He's got good size, former JUCO kid. Number 91, if you're watching Akron games in the fall, I'm stunned that somebody didn't come out and get him in the portal. Akron does lose a couple of guys in the secondary. They're 2 safeties. Thomas, he ended up transferring to Virginia. KJ Martin also departs. That would be one concern on the defensive side, but I think they're pretty well set up front on the front 7. Tim Tibesar, a pretty good coordinator at this level. 3rd years at DC. He's a longtime defensive coordinator. I believe he knows what he's doing. And again, with a crappy offense to not helping you out at all, and you're still in the top 35 in yards per play and total defense, he's doing a hell of a job here. Speaking of a hell of a job, I mean, Akron does welcome their best recruiting class since 2009. So, if they give Moorhead some time, there's going to be some upgrade in talent here. But just to show how far Akron is away from the top of college football, you don't have to get too creative. Look at week 1. Lines came out here since I last talked to you guys. They're available at probably half the books that are available, 14 or 15 books that have all the week 1 games. I don't care if it's the big games or the small games, they got them up. Akron's a 50-50, big 5-0, 50.5-point underdog at Ohio State in week 1. They're also at Rutgers, at South Carolina. Could be in an underdog in 10 or 11 games. I think they're better than what they've been the last couple of years, but I don't see it getting much better as far as a win-loss record. Maybe 3 wins if they're lucky. Let's talk a new coach. The only new coach in the MAC. There's been some stability, actually, in the MAC for a change. But the new coach is actually in Buffalo, and he's a familiar name if you followed the MAC or coaching circles in general over the last 10, 15 years. Pete Lembo is back in the MAC once again. They certainly, before we talk Pete Lembo, let's talk about their former coach, Maurice Linguist. Certainly the program took a step back under him compared to what they were under Lance Leipold, who's doing a bang-up job at Kansas after doing a bang-up job here at Buffalo. Linguist left, basically took a position job at Alabama. I know he's quote-unquote co-defensive coordinator, but I expect that to be Womack's defense there in Alabama. But he decides he's going to walk away. Pete Lembo steps in. I think he's won everywhere he's been as a head coach. Lehigh, Elon, Ball State back in the day, 112-65 is his career straight-up record. He's been an elite. If you follow coaching circles, Pete Lembo is as good as it gets as far as special teams, and that's where he's been coaching the last decade. Last 3 years at South Carolina. And South Carolina 2 years ago had the best special teams in the country. So I like the hire. I think he's an upgrade. Longtime OC, Pat Nowdy. I'm sure I'm butchering that name. He's been most recently at Georgia Tech Old Dominion as the OC. He's the new offensive coordinator here. I haven't been overwhelmed with his offenses. He's an older guy. Probably the game's passed him by a little bit. He's the new OC. The new DC is a young kid, Joe Bowen. He's never been a defensive coordinator before. He was Miami Ohio's linebackers coach the last couple of years. Miami Ohio's linebackers as good as any position group in the MAC. So that's kind of an outside-the-box type of hire for Lembo there as far as the coaching staff. Let's talk roster. Intriguing as far as what's back and what's not. Zero, big fat zero on the skill positions. Returning for Buffalo. Quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends, wide receivers. None of the starters from last year are back. I thought Ron Cook was their best player probably on offense. Daryl Harding, best wide receiver. Both of them gone. They didn't do much, though. With that being said, didn't do much on offense last year. They only averaged 4.6 yards per play. That was number 126 in the country. Cole Snyder, the quarterback, left for another MAC school. He left for Eastern Michigan. He was a 2-year starter here at Buffalo. They had 6 quarterbacks in the spring taking snaps. I would argue probably C.J. Agbana probably is a favorite to start. He got some snaps last year. Certainly more runner than thrower, so we'll see what happens in fall camp. But old adage is if you got 2 quarterbacks, you got none. What if you have 6 quarterbacks? I don't like the quarterback position here for Buffalo, at least in 2024. I already mentioned top 2 running backs are gone. Top 5 wide receivers depart. A couple of guys keep an eye on. Nick McMillan flashed big time all spring, especially in the spring game. Also a transfer from Boston College, Taji Johnson. I've watched Boston College spring games, 2022, 2023. He flashed in both of them big time. So hopefully he can put it together here as he takes down a step down in competition from Buffalo. As far as the offensive line, 3 starters back, led by guard Tyler Doty. Center, though, Wright transferred to Maryland post-spring, so they lose a starter after expecting him to play for you. They go through all of spring, and then he ends up leaving. Speaking, though, on the positive side, as far as transfers, Buffalo is trying to fill out their roster. They've already added 8 guys since May as far as transfers, trying to fill out that roster. One of them being Sean Dolak, who's returning to Buffalo after he originally transferred to Utah State in January. That's a big win for Buffalo. This is a guy that had 147 tackles here in 2022 before being banged up last year. His replacement, after he got banged up last year, Red Murdoch, he also flashed 9.5 tackles for a loss. He's coming back. Unfortunately, their leading tackler, Andresian, is gone, as is their leading pass rusher. So a little bit of guys that they're going to have to replace production-wise on the defense. Guy I really liked on tape, unfortunately, another guy that's gone. Their safety, Devin Grant. He ended up transferring to Syracuse. I think he starts for the Orange this year. Big-time loss there in the back end of the defense. So what's the expectations for Buffalo? Well, I think they'll top last year's 3 wins. Can they get to 6-6? I think that's pushing the envelope a little bit. I certainly think 5-7 is more likely than 6-6. I will say outside of a road trip to Missouri, no game on the schedule is unwinnable. In fact, I got 9 of their 12 games at least priced right now in the single digits. So they can play clean football, smart football, rely on defense and special teams. Maybe they win a majority of them and they flirt with bowl eligibility. Next up, Eastern Michigan. Chris Creighton already entering year 11 here in Ypsilanti. Eastern Michigan, if you forget, arguably maybe the worst program in the country in the FBS. And Creighton's made him respectable. 6 bowl games for him. They only had one in their entire history before he came along. In the last 8 years, he's 49-47. So he's turned arguably the worst program in the FBS to basically an average program, at least at the G5 level. Last year, though, I will say, wasn't one of his best teams. In fact, I'd argue it's one of his worst. In fact, the worst team since year 2 for him. You look at yards per play margin, number 129, outgained nearly by 140 yards per game. That was number 132 in the country. That does not scream bowl eligibility, which somehow, some way, Eastern Michigan got the bowl eligibility last year. Those two stats scream like you should have been 2-10, not 6-6 in the regular season. So when I see something like that, usually I'm looking for regression there. As far as returning starters, not much to choose from. Bottom 15 in returning production, only 8 returning starters. On the positive side, they did a really good job in the transfer portal. The best transfer class in the MAC, led by quarterback Cole Snyder. I already mentioned him. He comes over from Buffalo, a 2-year starter. They went out and got some guys at the Power 5 level as well. Delbert Mims from NC State, a running back. Productive linebacker from Coastal Carolina the last couple of years. JT Killen comes in. Offense has a lot of work to do because I'll be honest with you, it was pretty horrific last year. Number 129 in yards per play, number 132 in yards per game, 120 in points per game. And the thing it is, the one thing that they could hang their hat on last year was that running back, Samson Evans and Jalen Jackson. They're both gone. I think Jalen Jackson's a pretty good pickup for Iowa State. Keep that name in your back pocket, Jalen Johnson. He's kind of a jitterbug. They also lost their top wide receiver, Tanner Canoe, top offensive lineman, Brian Dooley. I do like their left tackle, Rewalinski. Easy for me to say. He's back at left tackle for them. Defense, they lose their top 2 linebackers who combined for 279 tackles last year. Not a typo. Did not misspeak there. Their top 2 linebackers, Klein and Sarapicio, 279 tackles a year ago. They're both gone. Justin Jefferson flashed a little bit last year. He's back. Peyton Price I like up front on the defensive line. To me, as far as breaking down, I want to give Chris Creighton the benefit of the doubt, but unless all the transfers are hits, I think it's going to be tough for them to make a bowl game this year. And we're going to get a good look on how good they are, or lack of being any good or improved this year. You'll laugh at this, but I actually think one of the better matchups in week 1, at least getting an idea of who these teams are and the young start to a season. Eastern Michigan's at UMass. 2 teams power rated very similarly. I think Eastern Michigan's a little bit better, but it is in Amherst. Right now, UMass is -1 in the week 1 market, so we'll figure out if Eastern Michigan is as bad as they were a year ago or if they're a little bit improved. Right now, I have my doubts as far as them getting back to a bowl game, though. Speaking of doubts, I'm going to have a pretty pessimistic tone as far as the next team goes, and that's Ball State. Mike New entering his 9th season. He's had one winning season so far, and the problem is it was that 2020 COVID season. They won the MAC. They finished in the AP Top 25, but that being the COVID season, that's certainly the outlier when your other 7 seasons are losers. Last year, the offense really struggled, number 122 in total in scoring offense. Defense was solid. If you remember, and you were a weekly listener, I talked about this Ball State defense at the end of last season. I really liked their defensive coordinator, Tyler Stockton. Unfortunately, he left for Boise State, but they were number 17 in the country in total defense. That allowed them to have pretty okay stats for a 4-8 team. They were only outgained by 8 yards per game last year. And in the second half of the season, they were a much better team. Final 6 games, they went 3-3. They split them out. Their 3 losses were by a combined 12 points to Toledo, Mile, Ohio, and Bowling Green, all bowl teams in the MAC. So they're playing their best ball at the end of the season. The problem is other people are paying attention. They got 2 new coordinators this year. I like Knowles, their new DC, comes over from FCS Butler. But again, Stockton off to Boise State. That's a really good hire for Boise State. I love Tyler Stockton, one of the young, good defensive minds in college football. As far as the returning production, as far as the players go, again, bottom. 8 returning starters is all. Bottom 20 in returning production. Some big-time names, though, on the positive side. It was going to be even worse for Ball State. And I just read another preview magazine. They had these guys gone. They're actually coming back. Kyle Kelly, a quarterback, a dual-threat kid, ran for over 700 yards last year. He put his name in the transfer portal, withdrew his name from the transfer portal. So Ball State, that's a big positive for them post-spring. Their tight end, Cozio, one of the better tight ends in the MAC, he returns. He took his name, withdrew his name from the transfer portal. Their top wide receiver, Magwood, and then an Eastern Illinois transfer, Bowick. He had a good spring. So there's some weapons here on offense. There wasn't much explosiveness in the pass game. They got to get Kyle Kelly improving as a passer to take advantage of some of those weapons on the outside. Unfortunately, though, they did lose a kid post-spring, that being their outstanding running back, probably their best player. Cooper, over 1,000 yards, transferred to San Diego State. Again, another good pickup for Sean Lewis. Love Sean Lewis. That hire there for the Aztecs, but Ball State loses Cooper, their top player, to San Diego State post-spring. They really trying to shore up the offensive line. You include transfers and freshmen. 6 offensive tackles they added this offseason. They do bring back both guards. They graded out as 2 of their top 3 offensive players per Pro Football Focus. So there's some pieces to work with certainly on offense. I repeat, cannot say that about the defense. This is a defense that was decimated. Only 2 starters back. One of them was their lead. I will say one of the 2 starters back is their leading tackler, Newsome, in the back end. But Sidney Houston was a big loss. He had 17 tackles for loss. Mike New pointed towards a couple of lower-level transfers. Tolsma and Justin Thomas as guys who stood out in the spring, but I'm not buying it. When you lose Tyler Stockton and a bunch of players, I think the defense regresses big time this year. And speaking of pessimism, the schedule is a horrible, I cannot repeat this enough, horrible setup for this schedule. Ball State has a bye in week 1. Everybody else in the country is playing. Ball State's got a bye week. And then they host an FCS team, Missouri State. But then after that, they play 5 of their next 6 games on the road. They're going to be an underdog in at least 5 of those 6 games. They might only be favored in 3 games this year. I think this will be Mike News last year. So if you want a hot take, there you go. Mike News last year, Ball State in Muncie this year. Central Michigan up next, as I'm going to take a sip of water here. Sorry, guys, 25 minutes of talking solo. Throat needs a little bit of moisture. Jim McElwain, 6 seasons already. Wow. It's been a mixed bag. I got to tell you, when Central Michigan a couple years ago, flashback, this was, I believe, New Year's Day, because it was delayed, I think, due to COVID or something. So Central Michigan beats Washington State in the Sun Bowl. It's on CBS. I thought Central Michigan was going to be the top MAC program. They're 9-15 the last 2 years. So what do I know? Last year, boy, statistically, they were pretty bad. Number 116 in yards per play margin, 111 in yards per game margin, number 113 in points per game margin. They were 5-1 in games decided by 1 possession. So clearly not as good as their record indicated, even though they had a disappointing season a year ago, Central Michigan. This year, they don't have an OC as we're taping this in late May. Paul Petrino departed. McElwain's certainly capable of calling plays. That's his forte, but no OC. Returning starters, there is a little bit of experience to work with here. Although quarterback Bauer, he departed. They brought in 3 new quarterbacks this offseason, including a kid from Iowa, Joey Lavis. I'm sure I'm, again, butchering his name. He played a little bit at Iowa. Bert Emanuel Jr. is back. Ton of explosiveness. If you ever watched him play the last couple of years, he just has not developed into a consistent passer yet. If he ever does, look out. Top 2 rushers are back. This is good for them. I thought it was the best unit on the team. Top 6 receivers are back. I like that Jesse Pruitt kid. Their top offensive lineman's back. Sarah Piglia returns. So offense, I think, in much better shape than the defense, because even though the defense has 7 starters back, I can make a case that their top 4 defensive players depart. Leading tackler, Trey Jones, a safety, transferred to Texas A&M. Second leading tackler, Moretti, transferred to San Diego State. Again, another good pickup for Sean Lewis at San Diego State. There's a hint there. Several hints. Quindario Lee, transferred to Houston, a defensive end. And then my favorite player was their tackle, defensive tackle, that Bristol kid. He flashed to me. I was watching Michigan State, the season opener last year. I'm like, who in the hell is this kid? He ended up being their highest graded player at Pro Football Focus. He departs. So top 4 guys gone on that defense. One guy I do really like that's coming back is that cornerback Dante Kent. Now, he takes some risk and stuff, so sometimes he gets beat, but he flashed more often than not on tape for me. Let's look schedule. Tough, difficult, because while the non-conference schedule is manageable, there's no, opening up with at Michigan State, at Notre Dame like last year. Conference schedule has them playing at Miami, Ohio, at Toledo, at Northern Illinois, arguably top 3 teams in the league. So I have my doubts as far as them making bowl eligibility. And, man, if that's 3 straight losing seasons, you got to wonder if McElwain will be back for year 7. Not sure, especially with some of the stuff happening off the field as far as the program goes. Next up, another directional school in the state of Michigan. It's Western Michigan. Another school that's kind of, fallen on a little bit of hard times the last couple of years. They had 8 consecutive bowl eligible seasons. The last 2 years, 9-15 is all. They got a lot of ground to make up because in Lance Taylor's first year, they were number 118 in yards per play margin, 114 in scoring margin. Now, they did play 3 Power 5 teams last year, plus the 3 teams in the MAC that ended up winning double-digit. It got the double-digit wins, so they had a pretty difficult schedule. I thought they were making some solid progress, but then last 2 games, it was basically a no-show for them. Second year for head coach Lance Taylor, but he lost both coordinators. Esposito left for the Michigan defensive line job. I thought Esposito was one of the better coordinators in the MAC. Now, this is in the weeds a little bit, but I have some concerns here. Robert Bala was supposed to be their new defense coordinator, but then he left for Washington after a couple weeks on the job, so they had to promote from within. Scott Power, who's from Louisiana Tech, he was fired from Louisiana Tech at the end of last season. He's going to be the new DC. Walt Bell's the new OC. Familiar name, Walt Bell. Ton of experience, but no recent success for either of the 2 coordinator hires. So that's not a positive. I mean, it's a Western Michigan team that I thought when I was looking at the returning production, what they had coming back, this is going to be one of the sleeper teams in the league. I don't like not having your OC and DC. As far as returning starters, though, this is the most experienced team in the MAC. 16 returning starters. Top 20 in the country in returning production. They signed their best recruiting class since 2016. So positive there. They have 7 incoming transfers from Power 4 schools, led by Popeye Williams from Louisville. They only lost 2 transfers to Power 5 school or Power 4 schools. So you like the personnel here. Hayden Wolf's back at quarterback. He had a good completion percentage. Not a lot of big plays. We'll see. J.D. Davis, the backup, impressed in the spring. Buckley is back at running back. He ran for over 1,000 yards last year. 3 of the top receivers are back, led by Womack. They didn't have a lot of big play potential in the receiving game last year, so what they did is brought in a couple of G5 transfers, Mortimer and Parker, 2 guys that averaged 19 and 39. That's right, 39 yards per catch last year. So a couple of big play receivers. They go to the G5 level and get a couple of kids like that. It's also maybe the best offensive line in the MAC. Interior, especially on the interior. Center Gideon and right guard West. I like them quite a bit. Their best defensive player on the other side of the ball, as good as the offense is, best defensive player did go to the second round of the NFL draft, and Nealon on the defensive line. Obviously, Fisk was also a couple years ago on this defensive line. That was a pretty good defensive line in Western Michigan a couple years ago because he also went in the second round of the draft. Everyone else pretty much returns. 2 guys that stood out to me on tape, Wahlberg at linebacker. He was a transfer from Purdue last year. Corey Walker, 6'5", 270. He had a bunch of TFLs a year ago. Those are 2 guys that stood out on tape for me. As far as the schedule, I don't like the start at Wisconsin, at Ohio State. You're going to get beat up a little bit. But there's probably no other game on the schedule that I'd classify as unwinnable. So I think they can make a bowl game this year. So go 4-8 to a bowl game. That's progress as far as year 2 for Lance Taylor there at Western Michigan. Ohio is next. And this Ohio team going to take a step back this year. But with that being said, let's talk about what they've done the last couple of years. Off back-to-back 10-win seasons for the first time in school history. Really solid team last year, including a win over Iowa State. Great defense. Number 4 in the country in total D, number 6 in scoring D. They were plus 21 in sack differential, number 30 in yards per game margin, number 33 in scoring margin. So a really legitimate team last year. I think the most remarkable thing about the program is I mean, this is still a program that hasn't won the MAC title since 1968. They've been to 13 bowl games in the last 18 years and still can't win a MAC title. I think they've been to 5 MAC championship games and haven't won a single one. Tim Albin is doing a good job. I think a lot of people thought the program would fall off the face of the earth after Frank Solich shockingly retired. Albin's doing a good job. Last 2 years, 10 wins. He's got his work cut out for him this year. New OC, new DC, they're both promoted from within. But more importantly is they don't have anybody back for the most part. 5 returning starters. Bottom 10 team in the country as far as returning production. 24 players transferred, including 12 to Power 4 schools. They lost 3 starters post-spring. A roster that's been decimated. Curtis Rourke off to Indiana. Probably starts at Indiana quarterback. I will say Parker Navarro got an early jump on 2024. He started the bowl win over Georgia Southern. I was impressed, especially with his running ability. Similarly at running back, Bangura's off to Minnesota. Ricky Hunt steps in the bowl game, scores 5 touchdowns as they stunningly crushed Georgia Southern in that game. Tyus at running back from Northwestern. Keep an eye on him. Top 6 receivers, unfortunately, depart. Wiglis was one of my favorite at the G5 level. He's gone. 4 of those top 6 receivers transferred to Power 4 schools. Kazmarek went to Ohio State at tight end. I went to the Buckeye spring game, and he flashed. He's going to play. He's going to get some snaps this year. That's a big-time loss. You lose a kid to Ohio State, and he's going to play a bunch of snaps at the Buckeyes. Offensive line brings back a couple of starters. Top 2 guys departed. Their right tackle departed and transferred post-spring. Not good. Speaking of not good, the defense loses their top 2 linebackers, Houston and Thompson, combined for 497 tackles the last 3 years. That's a lot of snaps gone. 2 guys that have been your mainstays the last 3 years are gone. Spring footage that I watched, they're really expecting Shea Taylor to be the guy this year at linebacker. On the positive, Bradley Weaver, again, I was just reading a publication, had him gone from the team. He actually withdrew his name from the portal. He had 13 tackles for loss on the defensive line. But they did lose their other best pass rusher, Buell, to Colorado post-spring. Not good. A couple guys that flashed that, that didn't maybe necessarily get a lot of snaps. Brawley at safety. It's a kid that maybe step in and get some increased production this year. They also really like this Adonis Williams kid, who obviously put up some stats last year, but he might be one of the leaders on that defense this year. Marcel Walker's a recent kid in the last week that they added, a starter from Nevada at edge, a pretty productive player, so that's a positive. A lot of FCS transfers have got to be hits. They did sign Ohio, their best recruiting class since 2008. Schedule's not, overly difficult. I still, even though I got them downgraded significantly, I can still see them being favored in as many as 7 games. They're not going to win 10 for the 3rd straight year. But I would be shocked if they don't make a bowl game this year as far as Ohio. They lost a lot of guys prior to the bowl game last year. What those guys do, went out and crushed Georgia Southern. That was impressive. So I like what Tim Albin's doing here, but he does have his work cut out for him. A couple more teams here. I believe we're down to 4. As I try to get this, Payne said, hey, you got to keep it under an hour. Nobody wants to be listening to you over an hour on these G5 podcasts all flying solo. So we're going to get to my alma mater, Bowling Green. Last year, kudos, thumbs up. Best year as far as the power rating goes since 2015. I originally didn't like the Scott Loeffler hire, but he's doing a good job here. It's been a slow build. He's built the program the right way. It's not that, he didn't go for, 30, 40 transfers in year 1 and try to turn it around immediately. He's built it through high school recruiting, and he's had some continuity on the coaching staff, and they haven't lost an overwhelming amount of players to the portal. So that tells me it's a pretty good culture. They went from 0 wins in the COVID year to 4 wins to 6 wins to 7 wins the last 4 years. And I got to tell you, it could be even better this year. I like you popping the tape. If you're not believing me, oh, Brad, you're a homer. You went to BG. No, I mean, popping the tape. They competed very well against Michigan. They intercepted J.J. McCarthy 3 times in that game. They outright upset Georgia Tech as a 3-touchdown underdog. Go watch the tape. Legitimate win. They were the better team that day. Played Minnesota tough in the bowl game. And so I was okay with that result. Played Toledo, their arch rival the last 2 years, to the wire. Both times, won 1, lost 1. The most talented team in the MAC. Last year, you look at them statistically, pretty average. And that's pretty good considering how bad this program has been lately. They were positive in yards per play margin, positive in yards per game margin, positive in points per game margin. all of those marks much better than what they were. They're kind of a phony 6-win team in 2022, not so much last year. What do they got coming back this year? Well, Basilak and Orth are back at quarterback. Neither one participated in the spring, but they're expecting both to be healthy for the fall. I'm not a huge fan of either one. Obviously, Basilak will get the start, but they're not asked to do too much in the offense. And Basilak, I will say, was better in the last half of the season than he was in the first half. A couple of weapons I do like. Stewart at running back is, I would describe as a bowling ball, averaged over 6 yards per carry. They have a kid at tight end, and man, they also call it like flex because he can play. I mean, he can come out of the backfield, play like an H-back, tight end, you name it. Harold Fannin. This kid, I think, is an NFL prospect. I really think he's one of the better players in the MAC, so keep an eye on him. He's number 44. They really utilize him quite well. And again, I think if he's healthy, he'll get drafted next year. Wide receivers an issue. They lose their top 3 guys, Keith Hilaire and Osborne at wide receiver. I've read some good articles about this Kansas State kid, RJ Garcia. We'll see how productive he can be. Offensive line is in good shape. 4 starters back there. A little bit more holes on defense, so for the Falcons. They did lead the nation in takeaways a year ago. I did say, hey, they didn't lose too much as far as the portal here recently. They did lose a couple guys on defense. Howell, their best pass rusher, he transferred to Texas A&M. Jalen Husky, their best cover corner, transferred to Maryland. So that's a little bit of concern. Their leading tackler graduated, Darren Anders. A couple guys that did stand out to me on tape, Oladokin, and this Northern Illinois transfer kid, C.J. Brown, who flashed a couple years ago at Northern Illinois. He's expected big things out of him as far as the back end of that defense goes for BG. Schedule, I mean, I'm not wild about playing at Penn State and at Texas A&M. Again, I'm speaking as an alum right now. But I got to tell you, after that, BG could be favored in as many as 8 games this year. I'm expecting a 3rd straight bowl season, and considering how bad this program was for 5-6 years, kudos, Scott Loeffler. You're exceeding expectations as an alum. Maybe I'll start sending in those donations and those checks again. I stopped giving a few years ago once I read an article about the hiring process for one of their coaches, Mike Jinks. Ooh, the check stopped at that point when I read about that hire. Google it. It's unbelievable. Next up, Northern Illinois. We got a couple more here, guys. Got to say, Northern Illinois, I am not a huge Thomas Hammock fan. Hasn't been much consistency. Winless one year, they win the MAC the next year, 3-9 one season, win a bowl game last year. Very tough team to get a feel for. They're really Jekyll and Hyde. Stats says last year they were better than 7-6. They were number 40 in yards per play margin, 45 in yards per game margin, 53 in scoring margin. That says 8-9 wins, not 7. Returning starters, 14 for them, so there's a lot of pieces here to work with. Unfortunately, Rocky Lombardi can't come back for his 15th season of college football. His eligibility is finally exhausted. I would expect Ethan Hampton to get plenty of the reps, at least get first crack as far as quarterback goes. He's played the most the last couple of years outside of Lombardi. One of the better players in the MAC to me is Ontario Brown at running back. Guy ran for over 1,300 yards last year. To put in perspective how good he is, he was 3rd in yards before contact. Behind last year in college football, Ollie Gordon and Cody Schrader. You could say those are the top 2 running backs in college football last year, and Ontario Brown was 3rd behind those guys. So very impressive running back on tape. Travion Rudolph withdrew his name from the portal. That's a positive. He's their top wide receiver. I like this Barnes kid. Got good size, 6'5", 220, average 18 yards per catch. He's another receiving weapon for him. If you like old school football players, their fullback Lampy, 6'1", 252. I mean, just a old school blocker coming out of the backfield. Really like that kid on tape. 3 starters back on the offensive line, but unfortunately their top 2 guys are gone there. Defensively, the guy that really flashed to me, Thomas, their top guy, defensive end, Rasheem Thomas, he's back, so that's a positive. They could have the top secondary in the MAC. Their entire 2 deep's almost back. The returns there. Bird is a kid that I really like there. They were number 6 in Northern Illinois in pass defense a year ago. Didn't play a lot of great passing offenses, but still pretty solid, and everybody's back. You don't get that too often in college football these days. Again, I said at the top, it's tough to really pinpoint expectations as far as this team because they've been so Jekyll and Hyde, but I'll call for a bowl game this year. There's just too much coming back. Too many high-level players from Northern Illinois. It'd be a really disappointing season if they didn't make a bowl. Toledo, and then we'll get to Miami, Ohio last. Toledo's next up. Jason Candle. If you follow me on Twitter, not one of my favorites. Entering his 9th season here. He's 65-35. Got a couple of MAC championships. And you think, you're tough on this guy. 65-35. That sounds okay. I got to tell you, folks, he's won 2 MAC championships. He should have won 4 or 5 because every single year, Toledo by far has the best talent in the MAC almost every single season. And they leave a lot to be desired. The coordinators are entering their 5th seasons, so that's good to say the least. A lot of continuity, as much coaching continuity as any team in the country. Vince Carey's, I'm stunned. He's their defensive coordinator. I'm stunned he's not a Big Ten defensive coordinator or not a MAC head coach yet. I mean, this is a guy that was 95-6 at Mountain Union. His defenses are legit at Toledo, especially last year. And speaking of stats being legit, I mean, this was a Toledo team number 8 in the country in yards per play margin, top 25 in yards per game margin, number 20 in scoring margin, plus 28 in sack margin. Legit team. Probably you didn't hear much about them because they lost arguably their 3 most important games of the season. Lost the opener, heartbreaker to Illinois. Probably should have won that game. They blew a big lead late. Won 11 straight games. Then they lose the MAC championship game, and they lose by 1 in the bowl game. They win maybe 1 extra game there. You'd have heard a lot more about Toledo last season being in the mix. 5-2 in close games, regression. Speaking of regression, well, there's going to be some regression because they lose a lot of their top players. Bottom 15 in returning production for Toledo. Only 9 returning starters. They lose their dual threat 3-year starting quarterback in Daquan Finn. He goes to Baylor. 1,400-yard rusher Penny Boone's off the UCF after spending the spring in Louisville. 0 returning starters on the offensive line. That's not good. There is some pieces to work with. Tucker Gleason's gotten some experience at quarterback the last couple of years. Jacquez Stewart is a nice jitterbug at running back. I will say on the positive side, I think Toledo's got the best receiving corps in the MAC. Newton and Vander Ross at wide receiver. Torres at tight end. All dynamic weapons. That's pretty good 1-2-3 punch at receiver and tight end for Toledo. If Tucker Gleason can take care of the football, they should be okay there. Defense, a little bit concerned. Obviously, Quinyon Mitchell. I mean, only the second time Toledo's ever had a first-round draft pick. He goes, so that's a big-time loss in the secondary. Judge Culpepper up front, he's gone. Their best linebacker, Dallas Gant's gone. So they lose their top 3 players at each level. Keep an eye on safety MACtion Hook. I really like what I saw on tape from him. I also really like this Darius Alexander, defensive tackle, 6'4", 310. He stood out. You don't get too many guys in that 310 range at this level that really stand out. Best recruiting class yet again in the last 20 years. Jason Candle can recruit. Just X's and O's and developing. We'll see. As far as the schedule, it's pretty advantageous. Out of all the MAC schools and a lot of the G5 schools, Toledo knows how to schedule. They usually play an okay, Power 5 team that they can beat, a la Illinois last year. This year, Mississippi State. They wouldn't stun me if they beat Mississippi State on the road. No games unwinnable. They could be favored 9 or 10 games. So even though they take a major step back as far as talent level and experience level, they got the highest win total in the MAC for a reason right now in a couple of the sports books. Miami, Ohio, the defending MAC champ who beat Toledo in the MAC championship game last year is the final team we'll preview here. Chuck Martin entering his 11th season here. Overall record, you say, he sucks. He's 56-62. But he's won a pair of MAC championships. He inherited a Miami program. Yeah, proud tradition, but, man, they had fallen on recent hard times. Keep in mind their academic standards at Miami, Ohio are probably the tops in the MAC. In MAC play the last 8 years, Chuck Martin's 40-19. He really focuses in on winning MAC games, not necessarily the non-conference. Keep that in your back pocket. Stats-wise last year, and they're never going to overwhelm you in the stat department. He's just too conservative, but they were top 25 in scoring margin, thanks to a defense that was number 7 in scoring. And the 11 wins for them last year were the most in 20 years. Back to Roethlisberger when he was at quarterback for him back in 2003. Returning starters, they got some pieces, obviously, with 13 returning starters. Coordinators are the same. Did lose some guys, some studs, as you would expect from a team that won the MAC. Amos at running back is at Ole Miss, top Wide receiver, Larvadan, transferred to South Carolina. Top sack guy, Williard, transferred to Oklahoma. Ole Miss, South Carolina, Oklahoma. And how about their kicker, Graham Nicholson, who won the Lou Groza Award as the top kicker in the country last year. He was 27 out of 28. He transfers to Alabama post-spring. That's 4 key guys going to 4 big-time programs. So that's some talent lost there. On the positive side, Brett Gabbert's back yet again. It feels like his 10th year as a quarterback. Can he stay healthy, though? Because they don't have Avion Smith this year to back up and save their season like he's done the last couple of years. So if Gabbert, and this is a big if, can stay healthy, they're fine there, but we'll see. He's pretty injury prone. 4 starters back on the offensive line. Not a huge fan of their skill positions. They did sign a good recruiting class. And the biggest positive for Miami, Ohio, and why they're the last team I'm talking about here in this MAC preview, is the defense. If we're stack ranking units in the MAC, Miami, Ohio's defense is the best unit in the MAC. Offense, defense, special teams, the defense for Miami, Ohio is the best. It's a team, they don't blitz and still they get pressure. Salopek at linebacker is a tackling machine, 144 last year. He's a MAC Defensive Player of the Year. Ugu's back at defensive end. He had 8 sacks. Secondary concerns me a little bit. They lost 3 of their top players. That McKee kid was pretty good. I was rewatching the Cincinnati game. He stepped up. Speaking of Cincinnati, they're one of their tough games early. 4 of their toughest games are in their first 5 weeks. At Northwestern, Cincinnati, at Notre Dame, and at Toledo. Now, they'll probably be favored in their last 7 games, but it could be a tough start for Miami, Ohio. So how do you attack them? Maybe you get some line value with them once they enter MAC play because they're sitting there with a not so good record. Maybe they've lost a few. Also, I will say it wouldn't shock me if they won upset of Northwestern and Cincinnati. They're only a 3-point underdog at Northwestern in week 1, so that shows you how much respect the market's giving this Miami team. So that'll do it for the MAC. A little bit long-winded. Went about 15 minutes there. Hit all 12 teams. The reason I'm not going to give you a win total best bet as far as the MAC goes is it's just not widely available enough. Like a FanDuel and a couple other places don't have them up yet as far as the conference. So, again, I will double back to the MAC as far as giving out a season win total best bet on a future podcast. Again, there'll probably be one podcast coming up here in the next few weeks where I give out 3 best bets. But this week's best bet is actually going to come from the conference I talked about last week. And make sure you're listening to that at Bet the Board as far as last week's Conference USA preview. There are enough places that have Conference USA win totals up. We're talking DraftKings, FanDuel, ESPN Bet, a few others. And we're going to go towards Louisiana Tech. And your first best bet recommendation as far as college football 2024 on the Bet the Board podcast, we are going under the total, under 5.5 wins, Louisiana Tech. Under 5.5 wins, Louisiana Tech. Now, unfortunately, you're going to have to pay a little bit of juice. We'll call it minus 150. There's a couple books that are a little bit less than that. There's a couple books that have a little bit more expensive than that price. Cheapest that I could find was DraftKings minus 145, but we'll call it minus 150 because it's kind of split as far as the books and what the pricing is there. But we're going Louisiana Tech under 5.5 wins, minus 150 or less. Shop around as always. What am I seeing? Well, it's kind of not what I'm seeing. This is a program that's won 3 games, won 3 games, won 3 games each of the last 3 years. And now they're expected to, if we lose his ticket, they're going to double that win total. I don't see it. Another thing I don't think Sonny Cumbie's that good of a coach. They don't do the little things right. They're 1-7 in games decided by 1 possession the last couple of years. Oh, Brad, regression. That means they're better than expected. No, I don't think they are. They don't do the little things. The penalties, they're one of the worst teams in the country. They don't take care of the football. And, man, to expect the team to go from 3 wins to 6, you would think, oh, they got a lot coming back. They don't. 2 guys on offense back as far as starters, 5 on defense. All their top players are gone. I don't see it in that league where I think there's a couple other schools that might have a little bit higher ceiling, like a UTEP or a Sam Houston State, and still obviously teams like Western Kentucky, Jacksonville State, Liberty are all better than them. So I'm not seeing as far as Louisiana Tech getting the bowl eligibility this year. We're going under 5.5 wins. Under 5.5 wins, Louisiana Tech, minus 150. That'll be your first best bet. We'll double back as far as the MAC goes on a future podcast. And next week, we're going to be previewing another G5 conference that's near and dear to me because I live in Las Vegas. And one of the main stories at G5 level last year was UNLV here in town and their season. And we'll see what they have in store for the upcoming season, along with Boise State, who might just be the best G5 team. We'll talk about that in deep detail as far as next week goes, but In the meantime, make sure you're following us all on Twitter at Todd Fuhrman, at Payne Insider, at Brad Powers, the number 7, and at Bet the Board Pod. Thank you guys for listening to me, and we'll talk to you next week.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.